Welcome to Butter Recaps. Remember, spoilers ahead. Enjoy. We open on a club with a menacing-looking man named Mark, who works as security at the establishment. Gene Gee, an old friend of Mark, asks Mark to help him out and participate in an arm wrestling match that was going on in the club. Mark reluctantly agrees and eventually wins. Dissatisfied with having his customer lose, the club owner harasses Mark, and Mark breaks the club owner's hand and quits. We later see Mark working at a different place, as security in a shopping mart. Moral of the story, don't mess with bouncers, much less if they have biceps bigger than your head. Gene Gee calls Mark. He lets Mark know that there will be an arm wrestling tournament in Korea soon. Mark, who used to be a professional arm wrestler, ultimately agrees to participate, and so Mark travels to Korea. Gene Gee gets Mark a cheap motel room. Mark, who was adopted at a young age, receives his birth mother's address from Gene Gee. Meanwhile, Gene Gee goes to see Yoo Chang-soo to ask him to become a sponsor for Mark. Yoo, who is unwilling at first, changes his mind after seeing Mark's videos. Mark travels to the address he receives. He meets Jun Hyung and Jun Hee, who are hostile towards him because they think he is a lone shark there to collect money. Mark decides to come back another time. Soo-jin looks through her mother's old items and finds a picture of her mother with a young boy. Soo-jin starts to become suspicious of Mark possibly being this young boy. Mark tries going back, but is found out by the kids again. Mark learns about the mother of the kids for the first time. Before the large competition, Yoo Chang-soo puts together a competition of a smaller scale. Seeing Mark win, Yoo is satisfied and even gives Mark and Gene Gee a hotel room to stay in. Yoo texts Gene Gee privately and tells him that in the second round, he should have Mark lose on purpose. Gene Gee agrees to do so and fervently begs Mark to follow suit. In the beginning, Mark had every intention to follow Yoo's order, but upon seeing Soo-jin, who had followed Mark to the competition arena, get harassed by Yoo, Mark wins the second round, going against the agreement. Gene Gee approaches Soo-jin at her workplace asking what her relationship is with Mark, claiming Mark went against their plan as soon as he saw her there. Mark goes to meet Soo-jin at her workplace at a shopping center. Just then, Yoo and his men are there to collect on debt and they intend to wreak some havoc. Seeing this, Mark swiftly takes care of all Yoo's men. However, when security get to the scene, Mark ends up at the police station, having received all the blame instead. However, Soo-jin ends up coming down to the station as well, and it is revealed that Soo-jin has found out that Mark is her stepbrother and that Mark's mother had passed away just last year. Mark gets released thanks to her. Mark ends up staying with Soo-jin and her children. When Mark packs his bags and is about to leave due to a misunderstanding and miscommunication with Soo-jin, he meets two of Yoo's men outside that have come to collect on debt from Soo-jin. Mark tells them that only the kids are inside at the moment and that they should leave. One of the men talks back to Mark. Mark handles them both. Beautifully done, Uncle Gilgamesh. Gene Gee, frustrated that the sponsorship has ended, comes up with the idea to call his senior who works in broadcasting and tells him of Mark's situation. As time passes, Mark becomes more like family and gets closer to his niece and nephew. Mark even ends up promising the kids that he would win the national arm wrestling competition. With the help of Gene Gee Sr., Mark's story comes to light on the media. Everything from losing his qualifications as an arm wrestling athlete unfairly to his adoption story. Despite all the media coverage, unfortunately, there was no one willing to sponsor Mark. Desperate, Gene Gee goes back to Yoo to ask for his sponsorship again. However, Yoo states that he has found another player who just got out of prison called Punch. Punch was famous for breaking his opponent's hands when arm wrestling before he went to prison. That evening, Mark finds out through Jun Hyung that Mark's mother used to write Mark emails. Mark then hurriedly checks his emails. Through the emails, Mark finds out that Soo-jin is not his stepsister and was a new neighbor to his mother when they first met. They ended up living together because she was a single mom and eventually became like family. Soo-jin had planned to tell Mark the truth after bringing him to his mother's grave, but Mark ends up bringing the matter up first. Mark expresses his feeling of betrayal after feeling like he finally found family and tells Soo-jin that they aren't family anymore. Gene Gee tries to stop Mark, but Mark ends up telling Gene Gee how he feels about him as well, like the fact that he knew Gene Gee was using him for money. Mark states he only stayed because he thought of Gene Gee as a younger brother. Mark starts to live separately from Soo-jin and her family. Mark ultimately ends up training alone for the national competition. Gotta love a good training montage. On the day of the tournament, Gene Gee approaches Mark and says sorry. Mark seems to accept his apology. At the venue, Yu comes over to Mark and Gene Gee to gloat and intimidate them. Mark meets Punch for the first time. The children see Mark on television and notice how dispirited he looks. They decide to go to the tournament to encourage him. Mark does well during the tournament. There seems to be more and more issues with his wrist and hand during each round he advances. During the tournament, Yu approaches Gene Gee and gives him 1 million won and promises another 1 million won after the tournament if Mark loses in the semifinals. Gene Gee says it's too late for bribes, but Yu brings up the fact that his father is in much debt, causing Gene Gee to waver. Gene Gee approaches Mark and tells him that maybe they should give up because they would receive money from Yu anyway. Mark states that he doesn't want to lose intentionally by taking dirty money. He mentions that this was his last chance and that he had a promise to keep to the children. Soo-jin receives a call from her children saying that they are at the venue, and Soo-jin eventually decides to go as well. In the semifinals, Mark is up against Combo, who is the Korean national champion. Mark has a tough match, but ultimately is able to win. After Mark wins the semifinal match, Gene Gee is pulled aside and beat up by Yu and his men because he broke the agreed upon conditions. Mark shows up and tosses Yu aside, saves Gene Gee, and makes his entrance into the finals. Mark and Punch finally meet in the finals. Soo-jin shows up just in time to see it. During the first round, Punch manages to hurt Mark's hand even further. Mark eventually comes dangerously close to losing, but as he looks up and sees Soo-jin in the crowd praying for Mark to win, everything seems to be in slow motion, and he remembers the promise he made as well as the reason he is there, his family. Mark manages to gather the last of his strength and eventually slams Punch's arm down to the other side, making Mark the victor. After the win, in an interview, he says that thanks to his mother, he now has a new family and that he misses her. Sometime later, we see Mark on a video call with his family. The children wish him good luck. We see that Mark has made it to the American Arm Wrestling Nationals and makes his entrance with Gene Gee. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more.